Hope that didn't reset it. But technical difficulties. Well, if you will take out your Megillas and turn to Hadassah. Since this week is Purim, you say, what did you say? Well, turn to your myrtle. Well, no, that's Esther, by the way. So her name meant myrtle. The Greek term that was translated is Esther. That was her Greek name as it came across. But her Hebrew name was Hadassah. There are two books, at least, that are named after women. And it's interesting because we have this story that is about real people. As we look at this situation, I want to tell you the story and then make some brief applications. This is in the time after the captivity. So it begins around 483 BC. So to understand a little bit, the people of God had forsaken Him. So God allowed them to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians for 70 years. After that 70-year period, a small remnant got to go back into the land. But pretty much everybody else stayed dispersed, including Esther, Mordecai, these Jews that we see in this book. Now, setting that stage, we have a king that it refers to as Ahasuerus. Now, which is known in history as Xerxes. This is the same Xerxes, the king of Persia, that is known. Many people, if you like history, you're probably familiar with the Battle of Thermopylae. And this is that Xerxes, which was known as a cruel man, a tyrant. That's very crucial to understand what kind of a man he was, because that sets the stage of where we are here. So now, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, has this feast, or he before he does that, he's showing off his wealth, he's showing off his splendor, because he's the kind of man who likes to show what he has. That's what he wants to do. He wants to show how powerful he is. He wants to show how great he is. And so he does this for 180 days, showing off his wealth and his kingdom and his splendor. At the end of the 180 days, he then has a feast. And in this feast, he's allowing the men in his court and the royals to drink and to party and pretty much do whatever you want to do. And while he's doing that, his queen, Vashti, is over in another place in the royal house with the women and the royal women. Okay? After about 7 days of this feast, finally, King Xerxes says, call for my queen and bring her over here, because I want to show everyone how beautiful she is. And yet, she refuses. Well, when she refuses, everybody is saying, we can't have this. A woman that's supposed to be the queen, not only is she doing a disservice to the king, she's pretty much doing a disservice to all the men everywhere. So they say, you better make a rule. This word will get out, and then women everywhere will be disobeying their husbands. And so let's make it a rule that all women everywhere are going to obey their husbands, whether you're a wife of a royal king or whether you're a wife of a peasant. It doesn't really matter. All women are to obey men. So they make this a rule, unchangeable, and let's get rid of this queen. That's the kind of king you have, and that sets the stage for now how Esther enters the picture. Okay? So Esther she was a captive. Her parents are dead, and so she's raised by her cousin, which is Mordecai. Now, they're both Jews, okay, living in this foreign land, and she's raised by her cousin. Now, her cousin, Mordecai, is serving in the king's court. Now, what you need to also understand, is that when they're looking for this replacement for Vashti, they gather all the young virgins all over the kingdom, and they're going to pick all these beautiful women and then have them all come and display before the king, and then he's going to pick one to be the queen to take the place of Vashti. So they gather all the fair virgins, and Esther happens to be one of them. So Esther is chosen. Now, you got to also understand that this wasn't just a fast process. So they have all these women that are there, and because she is highly favored, they really like her. Maybe because of the way she looks, maybe because of her personality on top of that, possibly. But what happens is they give her beauty treatments for a year. And she also is given maidens to help her and serve her. But at this time, she's not revealing that she is a Jew, because Mordecai tells her, don't do that. And so she obeys him, just like she did all growing up. Well, in the meantime, what happens is the king eventually chooses as the queen. Puts the crown royal on her, or she's now queen instead of Vashti. Well, in the meantime, Mordecai is still caring about her. He's checking on her. And then here's where the plot gets interesting. And it's crucial to the story, is that there are two men who may have this plot to kill King Xerxes. Okay? But Mordecai hears about it, and he protects the king. And he has those two men found out and executed because they were a threat, treason to the king. And then it's written down in the Chronicles. Hold that and table that thought, because that's going to come back up later to understand how this story gets very interesting. And what happens in the meantime, there is a man enters the picture. His name is Haman. Haman is, he's the kind of guy that really likes his wealth too. He likes his power, and he wants to show it off, and he wants more power. And he's not satisfied with what he has. He's got to keep going until he's top. And what happens is he's having everybody bow down and reverence him, and yet here is this Jew, Mordecai, who refuses to bow to him. Now we can debate why he should bow down or not, but he does try to explain that he's a Jew. Everybody else is saying, how come you're not bowing down? How come you're disobeying the king's command? Because the king commanded to bow down to him. Mordecai just ignores him. He's not listening. And he refuses to bow. So Haman is furious. I've got this one Jew who will not bow down to me. But he's not satisfied to just execute the one Jew. What he determines is, I'm going to punish all of them. I want all Jews wiped out. So he goes before the king. And he has the king basically come up with this law that's, what they're going to do is they're going to execute all the Jews. And they cast pur, or pur, which is basically a lot, to determine the day in which they're going to exterminate all the Jews. Well, and what they say is these people are diverse from all people. They're different than everybody. These weird people won't obey the laws, so let's make a decree and let's have them all exterminated. And Haman says to the king, I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver to make sure that it's done. And I looked that up, and one translator, or one commentator rather, said that that would be like $10 to $15 million in our time. And that commentary was written quite some time ago, so that would probably be equivalent of much more than that even now. All right, so about this time, what do you think Mordecai does? He's a Jew. He realizes we're dead people. Or this is difficult. He's in agony. He is mourning. He is weeping. And the way that they would show their mourning and sadness is they would tear their clothes. They'd put ashes on their head and on their garments. And because he's mourning like this, he can't go into the gate where the king is. He can't go in there and petition because he's mourning. They wouldn't allow him looking like that to come in there, so he stays outside the gate. Well, Esther is inside. And she has someone send to him to see how he's doing and tell him to come in. He refuses because of what's happened. And he has that person go back and tell the queen, tell her what's going on, that they have decided this day they're going to exterminate all of us. I need you to do something about it. I need you to go into the king and ask him to repeal this law or do something, because we're all dead if you don't do anything. And remember, at this point, up to this point, Esther has not showed to the king that she is a Jew. Now, but Mordecai charges her to tell the king to save the people. Well, Esther sends word back to Mordecai and tells him, I can't do this, because everybody knows, and there's this rule that you got to understand that is crucial to the story. The rule is, if anybody comes into the court of the king uninvited, and the king does not hold out his golden scepter, you're executed. You're done, because you walked in uninvited. And so she's reminding Mordecai by this messenger of this rule. I can't do it because he hasn't called for me any of these days. If I go in uninvited, I'm dead. So Mordecai sends back, and he says these famous words in Esther chapter 4, verse 3. Verse 13. Esther 4:13. Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. In other words, don't think that you're excluded from it, number one. Number two, verse 14, if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Now, how did he know that? Somehow Mordecai has a belief we're going to be delivered some way, somehow. Probably because he understands God's promises to Abraham to preserve them alive. They're God's people. God's not going to just let us all be exterminated. Yet they are in great distress. This is still serious. That's why he's been weeping. How would you feel if you come to find out all your people are going to die? So he's saying we're going to be delivered some way, somehow. I don't know how it's going to happen, but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Those are the famous words that were said to Esther. In other words, how do you know that you are placed where you are right now for this very purpose as a queen? You're in this kingdom. Maybe you are right where you ought to be in order to save us. So Esther sends an answer back to Mordecai and tells him, please have everybody fast for me for 3 days. Tell everybody to fast for me. Don't eat or drink, day or night. And I and my maidens will fast. And then I'll go into the king. And if I die, I die. And so she does that. Comes the day she puts on her, after the end of the fast, she puts on her royal apparel. She's cleaned up and she goes into the king uninvited. And the king holds out his scepter. Whew. And he says, what do you want, my queen? Ask me. I'll give you half of my kingdom. I don't know why kings are always offering half of their kingdom. But this king did. And she said, and it's interesting, she doesn't say, come right out and say, we're all about to die. Instead, what she does, she's a little wiser about it. She says, can we have a banquet? Come to a banquet today. You and Haman. Okay, so they do. And at the banquet, he says, what's your request? And she says, come to another banquet tomorrow. So it's like there's two banquets. Well, so then she goes, and they're all are going home, and so there's a banquet the next day. Haman goes home. He's like, the king is honoring people. I got invited to a banquet, just me and the king. And so he thinks, this is all fine and dandy. This is all great. He's just moving on up. And yet, there's a problem. There's that Mordecai. So he goes home and he's talking to his friends and his wife, and he's saying, I've been elevated. Look at all my wealth. Look at all these things that the king has given me. But I am not satisfied. You want to know why? There's this one small problem. And it's this Mordecai who will not bow down to me. And I cannot be satisfied with all of this until I do something about that guy. And so you know what they say? You know what his family and his wife says? Or the wise men around him? They say, I tell you what you ought to do. You need to make a gallows 75 feet tall. And you need to have Mordecai executed. Get rid of him. He's your problem. He's the one that's standing in your way. So he does. But in the meantime, it's that night. The king can't sleep. He's lying in his bed and he can't sleep, so he calls for a book to be read to him, which would be the records that the kings had. So they're reading in these records, and guess what they're reading? Remember when I told you back in the beginning there that there were two men that tried to kill the king, and Mordecai had them executed to save the king's life? Well, the king has this read before him that Mordecai's name is right here. He saved him from this plot. And so he asks, what's been done for Mordecai because of this? And they say, nothing. And about that time, somebody's in the palace. And guess who's there? Haman. And so he says, have Haman come in here. And then he says, Haman, let me ask you a question. I want to honor somebody. How should I honor them? And Haman is thinking, honor? That's got to be me. Who's he going to honor but me? It's got to be good. So I tell you what to do. What you need to do is put this guy on the king's horse, give him a ring, parade him through the street and through the city, and proclaim before him. Really make a big to-do about it. Then the king says, okay, be real quick about it and do that for Mordecai. Bum, bum, bum. So Haman thinks he's going to himself be honored, and the one guy that he can't stand is now the guy that he has to honor the way that he was wanting to be honored. My, how the tables get turned all of a sudden. So imagine having to be Haman, parading him through. I don't know how enthusiastic he could be, putting him on that horse, marching there with him as they're going through the street. I'm just trying to imagine this whole thing. And as this all happens, at the end of it, we have a banquet, see. So the queen had asked for this banquet, so now they're at a banquet. Now at this banquet, what can I do for you, queen? And she says, there is a person who wants to exterminate my people. Now she tells who her people are. And he wants to have us all done away with. And the king says, who is this? And she points at Haman and says, it's this wicked Haman. And about this time, the king leaves the banquet in a rage. He goes out into the garden, I guess just to have a moment, see how he's going to handle this whole thing. This is his right-hand man. Now come to find out, his right-hand man is wanting to have his own queen exterminated, who he favors. Now he goes back in, and here is Haman falling down before the bed, right in front of her, or the couch. And how does this look? The king thinks, is he going to assault her in the house? So about that time, the men put a sack over his head. And they take him out, and they hang him on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. You know, and so what he wished upon Mordecai happened to him. And so then what happens is, it's not all over yet, see. There's still this problem. Law's been made. Date's been set. Jews are supposed to be exterminated. Haman's out of the way. What are we going to do about this, though? So the king asks, what do we need to do? She says, well, let's write a letter. Let's repeal this. And he says to her and Mordecai, you can write it, and I'll sign it. I'll put my signet on it, and you can send it out. And what they said was that the Jews have the right to defend themselves, and they're even given power to do this. They end up defending themselves and kill 500 men. Then they execute 10 of Haman's sons. And then there's 75,000 on top of that that's also killed. And they don't take any spoil. But because of this, there's now this day, Purim, because they cast pur, which is a lot, to determine the death of or extermination of the Jews. From now on, all the Jews every year, and this week, Thursday and Friday is Purim of this year, happens to fall on. They will celebrate. They'll feast, and they'll give to the poor. Because they are alive, God saved them. Even though God's name is not mentioned in this book, we see God's hand and God's providence in protecting His people. We see some lessons here that are taken from this. Number one, I want you to see that the Bible is real. It's about real people. This isn't just a story that I just told. This is in the book of Esther. It's 10 chapters. I encourage you to go home and read it. And then, notice, let me read this to you. This is from the Bible Reader's Companion. It says, independent confirmation of Mordecai's rise to power comes from a cuneiform tablet found in Borsippa, which identifies Mardukah, which is Mordecai, as an official in the royal court at Susa, which is the Shushan Palace, as King James puts it, in the early years of Xerxes' reign, which King James refers to him as Ahasuerus. So these are real people. These aren't just stories, okay? This is not a children's story. This is a real event that occurred. That's point number one. Point number two is that God uses little people to do big things. God took an orphan girl who was taken captive, and she is somehow elevated. She becomes a queen, and she is able to save her people in those circumstances. Now, I've got to make a caveat point, is that I don't think Esther was totally perfect in the whole situation. She had some great qualities, which I'll talk about in a moment. I don't think she was totally perfect, because in Deuteronomy 7, verse 3, it says, neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. And if you just look at that commandment, every time that's broken, problems occurred. And actually, in this historical setting, which takes place, Esther falls between Ezra chapter 6 and chapter 7. And if you know anything about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the big problems that had occurred after coming back from the captivity was all of these Jews who had taken these foreign wives. And at the end of Ezra, they're having to remedy that situation, which was not an easy deal because a lot of them had children. And then in Nehemiah, he charges them straightly. He said, don't you have any clue what happened to why we got put in captivity to begin with? And the Jews understood that history, and that was when Solomon married all these foreign wives that turned away his heart. And because of that, God ripped apart most of the kingdom from him. And then later, because of their degradation and falling away from God and all of this, they are taken into captivity. That's why they are where they are, is because of the intermingling of marriages. And the children don't serve God. They serve the idols of the spouses that they marry. And now they're back in the land, and Nehemiah is charging them, let's learn our lesson. He's even to the point of plucking the men's beards out, charging them, say, do not marry these wives. And so, no, Esther should not have married the king. However, here she is. She wasn't perfect. She's not commended for her marriage. What she's commended for is now she's in the position where she's at, and now she's called upon a duty and courage to do something about it. Just like Rahab. Rahab the harlot is not commended for her harlotry. She's not commended for her lying. What she's commended for is her faith. She believed in God and she hid the spies. Not a perfect woman. But she goes down in history as one who acted in faith. Same thing here with Esther. Not a perfect woman, but she acted in courage. To go into this king. Let me tell you a little bit more about this king. This king had a man named Thagirus. You can look this up. This guy was very, very wealthy. He was like one of the wealthiest in the Persian Empire. Gave all of this wealth to Xerxes. And then they're on this way to this battle. And the guy that gave all the wealth to Xerxes says, can I ask one request? Can you allow one of my sons to stay home with me and work the farm? And the king says, you wretch, we're all going to war. And then he has his son executed right in front of him. The very man that just gave him all of this wealth. That's the kind of guy that Esther went into uninvited. This is the kind of guy that if other people knew in this day and time, you don't cross him. You don't test the guy. To test the guy is death most of the time, or a lot of the time. You're flipping a coin. Talking about them casting lots of which day to die. It would be like, roll of a dice to see whether or not you're going to die. I mean, heads you win, heads you don't. To go in before that king, read about him in history, see what kind of a person he is. That's who she went into. Because who's going to do it if she doesn't? And so what we see here is she acts courageously in a fearful time. Who knows whether you come into the kingdom such a time as this? What if we ask that question with you? Maybe it's not the kingdom, because you're not, I don't think any of us are in power like that. None of us are royalty like that. But who knows whether you are at the job you're at for such a time as this? Who knows whether you're in Northeast Ohio for such a time as this? Who knows whether you are here, sitting in this pew for such a time as this? To know what you ought to do, to be right with God. Who knows whether you have the family you have, and the children you have, or the parents you have, for such a time as this? Who knows whether you are, whatever your situation is, whatever you're capable of doing, whatever the odds are against you, what if everybody thinks you're going to fail, no matter what it is? What if you've experienced loss? What if you have a challenge? What if you're being threatened? What if you have enemies? You're not alone. Here's an example of someone who's in that very boat, who didn't just care about protecting herself, but she had a lot of courage. And she acted courageously to go in and petition before this king to save not just herself, but all her people. She said, I cannot sit by and I cannot endure watching my people be exterminated. I don't know. Do you have that kind of concern for your people and not just for yourself? That you care about your brethren? Can you endure to see your brethren suffer, whatever that situation is? And are you willing to humble yourself before God? Maybe even in sometimes if it requires you to weep, to fast. It's applied that they were praying when they were fasting. It doesn't say they prayed, but usually prayers accompany with fasting. Why else would they be fasting? And are you willing to do that at needed times in order to petition your God for deliverance? And then there's the great message, isn't it? That God is a great deliverer. He's able to deliver thee. That's one of the songs we sing. Looked like hope was lost. They're crying, they're weeping, we're all dead. Looks like we're done for. And how many times has that happened in the past with the Jews? It happened in Egypt in their beginning. They got a sea in front of them, and there's the army of the Egyptians and all their chariots coming after them. They got nowhere to go. These are not trained soldiers. And so God opens the sea and lets them cross over on dry ground. What great deliverance. God's a great deliverer. And here was a law that cannot be changed. The laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be repealed. And yet what they did was they had to make another law to allow them to defend themselves. And then they're safe. And how many times since then in history have people tried to exterminate the Jews? And yet God had promised a long time ago to Abraham, I will bless them that bless you, and I'll curse them that curse you. And God's keeping His promise. And God's a great deliverer. And this ought to give you a sense of comfort and joy and hope that no matter how hard, how bleak, how little things look, if you feel like I don't have much light at the end of my tunnel in my situation, it doesn't look too good, I'm trying to help you see that hope is a powerful thing. And yes, there is deliverance. And it can be by God. Psalm 7 verse 10 says, My defense is of God, which saveth the upright in heart. God judgeth the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. If you think that things look so unfair sometimes it seems that way. Haman's getting exalted. Mordecai is being sought against. Looks like things are lopsided at first. But look what God did. How He turned it the other way. If you ever feel like, how come some of these wicked people are getting rewarded, and I'm trying to do what's right, and it seems so hard. If you've ever felt like that, look at this story. And look what God did, how He turned it around. Maybe you're just in the part where it hasn't been turned around yet, so you need to hold on. Understand that God answers prayers. He hears our petitions. He hears our calls. When we cry out to Him, He feels your pain. He feels your mourning and your sighs. When Mordecai was crying, God heard him. When Esther was crying, God heard her. And then I want you to see also that anger and greed for power can come back and bite you like it did with Haman. You get to the point where I've got this, that's not enough, I need more. That's not enough, I need more. And eventually, you're just never satisfied. But in Psalm 26 verse 27 it says, Whoso diggeth the pit shall fall therein. He that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him. That's exactly what happened to Haman. He wished harm on Mordecai because he's that kind of a guy. And he wished harm on his kind. Racism. You ever fought a whole group of people because somebody in that group did you wrong. You felt. You didn't like what they did. So you think they're all like that. Well, that's what Haman did here. Don't associate the whole entire group with what a few in the group and a few bad apples within the group does, if that's what it is. Except in this case, that's still twisted even how Haman's looking at it. But then, one final point is one disobedience can affect generations a long time. I don't know if you noticed this point, but in chapter 3 and verse 1, it says that Haman is referred to as the Agagite. And if you look that word up, it comes from the word Agag. And those of you familiar with Bible history will know that God had told King Saul, the first king, to go and destroy all the Amalekites. And he kept King Agag alive. But then Samuel had to do the job that he didn't do, and so evidently there was a few left. And if that's the case, then this Haman is a descendant of Agag. If that's the case. If that's the case, they should have been exterminated by God's command in that particular case. If King Saul had done his job, Haman would not even have been alive. And so this threat would not even have been there. Now try that one on. So when God gives you a command to do and you think it won't affect anybody else. What I'm doing is on my own home. What I'm doing is no, this is just me. It's not hurting anybody else. If you're disobeying God, your disobedience can affect a lot of other people. And in this particular case, what King Saul did affected people many, many hundreds of years after him. And now the whole Jewish race was threatened because he didn't do what God had said. When God tells you to do something, do that. You don't know how that's going to affect your children. You don't know how that's going to affect the church. You don't know how that's going to affect other people, even if you think nobody else is looking. Do the right thing. Because your sins can hurt other people. So, it's a great book, isn't it? I hope that you've been encouraged by it. I hope that you've been encouraged to act. Now's the time to act. Maybe you are here for such a time as this. If you believe in God, if you believe in the God that provided His great providence and delivered the Jews in that time, God can grant you deliverance from your sin. He can wipe it away. You know, you've got a greater threat than the threat that happened to Esther and her people. And that threat ought to cause you to be in just as much tension and turmoil as she and Mordecai were for her people. And this threat is greater than what theirs was, because theirs was just going to cause them to die on the earth. This threat that I'm talking about is going to cause you to be lost eternally in hell, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, and there's no comfort. There's no relief. Day and night, tormented forever. And you want to be delivered from that great wrath. God's a great deliverer. He can deliver you. If you'll humble yourself before Him, just meet His request. It's not a hard request. It's simple. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you're willing to say that. I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Change. Turn from your sin and be baptized. Have your sins washed away. We're ready to assist you. And you can be delivered. And if you're a Christian, keep the faith. Don't ever lose heart. Don't ever lose hope. There's going to be times where you're going to be called upon to use the opportunity you have. No matter what the challenge is, you can say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Won't you do it while we stand and as we sing?